Chapter 4. Every sin must be punished, urged Satan. Lucifer came to resent the fact that he needed to approach the Father through the Son of God. He became jealous of Christ's position and began to lose sight of the fact that his existence and prosperity were dependent upon the Son of God. The only place in the universe to find a spirit of submission and obedience was in the heart of the Son of God. To reject him is to cut off all access to the Father. It is impossible to approach the Father in any posture other than gratitude, humility, and obedience. To come to God in any other way is to reject the true identity of God. On top of this, to approach God outside of the person of Christ automatically redefines the identity of the one approaching the throne. The identity of the Son of God as one completely submitted to and grateful to his Father is a perpetual reminder that all life comes from the Father, and that we all must recognize this fact and freely choose to live under his authority. The Son of God is the only safeguard against death. We must have his Spirit abiding in us to live.
Little by little, Lucifer came to indulge the desire for self-exaltation. The scripture says, "Thine heart was lifted up because of thy beauty, thou hast corrupted thy wisdom by reason of thy brightness." Ezekiel 28:17. "Thou hast said in thine heart, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God, I will be like the Most High." Isaiah 14:13 and 14. Though all his glory was from God, this mighty angel came to regard it as pertaining to himself. Not content with his position, though honored above the heavenly host, he ventured to covet homage, due alone to the Creator. Instead of seeking to make God supreme in the affections and allegiance of all created beings, it was his endeavor to secure their service and loyalty to himself. And coveting the glory with which the infinite Father had invested his Son, this Prince of Angels aspired to power that was the prerogative of Christ alone. Patriarchs and Prophets, page 35.2.
All of Lucifer's wisdom came from the Son of God. Christ's wisdom was and continues to be found in his gratitude to his Father for everything he possesses. Lucifer corrupted this wisdom by choosing to think that all that he had came from himself.
The high honors conferred upon Lucifer were not appreciated as God's special gift, and therefore called forth no gratitude to his Creator. He gloried in his brightness and exaltation and aspired to be equal with God. Patriarchs and Prophets, page 37.
Instead of seeing the Son of God as the guarantor of his life, Satan saw Christ as a threat to his rights and liberties. His way seemed right to himself, but in reality it was the path that led to death.
For you said to yourself, I will ascend to heaven and set my throne above God's stars. I will preside on the mountain of the gods far away in the north. I will climb to the highest heavens and be like the Most High. Instead, you will be brought down to the place of the dead, down to its lowest depths. Isaiah 14:13-15. New Living Translation.
Satan had experienced the love, kindness, and generosity of the Father and his Son. He knew their character was self-sacrificing love, yet knowing all this, he chose to follow a path of lies and deception.
To him, Satan, as to no other created being, was given a revelation of God's love. Understanding the character of God, knowing his goodness, Satan chose to follow his own selfish, independent will. The Desire of Ages, page 761.5.
In choosing the path of death, Satan became the author of death. All that was in the Son of God, Satan attributed to himself, and all that was in himself, he attributed to the Son of God. Here we find the origin of psychological projection. To shield himself from the convictions of conscience, he imagined his position, and Christ's were reversed.
By sly insinuations, by which he made it appear that Christ had assumed the place that belonged to himself, Lucifer sowed the seeds of doubt in the minds of many of the angels. The Review and Herald, February 4, 1909, Paragraph 1.
We see Satan following the same line of thought when Christ was here on earth.
When Satan and the Son of God first met in conflict, Christ was the commander of the heavenly hosts, and Satan, the leader of revolt in heaven, was cast out. Now their condition is apparently reversed, and Satan makes the most of his supposed advantage. One of the most powerful of the angels, he says, has been banished from heaven. The appearance of Jesus indicates that he is that fallen angel, forsaken by God and deserted by man. The Desire of Ages, page 119.2.
The Son of God had life in himself because he joyfully acknowledged his Father as the source of all life and the fountain of all law.
The Ancient of Days is God the Father, says the psalmist, before the mountains were brought forth, or ever thou hadst formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, thou art God. Psalm 90, verse 2. It is He, the source of all being, and the fountain of all law. The Great Controversy, page 479.2.
God's original and unborrowed life flowed into Christ, and as Christ had sealed in his heart the law of his Father and delighted to do his will, this unborrowed and underived life was Christ's inheritance forever. Satan therefore imagined that he was the one who had life original and unborrowed in himself, and that Christ was the tyrannical, controlling, arbitrary author of death. At a deeper level, Satan, knowing that he was in the wrong, judged himself worthy of death. His inward thinking is revealed in the verdict of Cain after murdering Abel. As Luther translates,
Kain aber sprach zu dem Herrn, meine Sünde ist größer, denn dass sie mir vergeben werden möge. Genesis 4:13, Luther Bible. But Cain said to the Lord, my sin is greater than that which shall be forgiven me. Genesis 4:13. Translation of Luther Bible.
and even the Douay-Rheims translation states it thus,
And Cain said to the Lord, my iniquity is greater than that I may deserve pardon. Genesis 4:13.
In Cain is manifested the thoughts of Satan. His self-condemnation was convicting his conscience.
He did not see whither he was drifting, but such efforts as infinite love and wisdom only could devise were made to convince him of his error. His disaffection was proved to be without cause, and he was made to see what would be the result of persisting in revolt. Lucifer was convinced that he was in the wrong. He saw that the Lord is righteous in all his ways and holy in all his works, Psalm 145:17, that the divine statutes are just, and that he ought to acknowledge them as such before all heaven. Patriarchs and Prophets, page 39.1.
In order to silence his conscience, he placed all his wrongs on Christ and put on him the sentence of death which he himself had judged. Here is the origin of penal substitution. Later on, the thoughts of Satan manifested again in Caiaphas.
You don't realize that it's better for you that one man should die for the people than for the whole nation to be destroyed. John 11:50, New Living Translation.
In order to address the deceptions of Satan, the Father assembled the hosts of heaven to make clear the identity of his Son, and that all beings should honor him as they honor the Father.
The King of the universe summoned the heavenly hosts before him, that in their presence he might set forth the true position of his Son and show the relation he sustained to all created beings. The Son of God shared the Father's throne, and the glory of the eternal self-existent one encircled both. Before the assembled inhabitants of heaven, the King declared that none but Christ, the only begotten of God, could fully enter into his purposes, and to him it was committed to execute the mighty counsels of his will. The Son of God had wrought the Father's will in the creation of all the hosts of heaven, and to him, as well as to God, their homage and allegiance were due. Christ was still to exercise divine power in the creation of the earth and its inhabitants, but in all this, he would not seek power or exaltation for himself, contrary to God's plan, but would exalt the Father's glory and execute his purposes of beneficence and love. Patriarchs and Prophets, page 36.2.
Satan at first yielded to this reality, but his desire for supremacy returned, and he then continued his policy of trying to switch places with the Father.
He, Satan, represented God in a false light, clothing him with his own attributes. Christ came to represent the Father in his true character. He showed that he was not an arbitrary judge, ready to bring judgments upon men, and delighting in condemning and punishing them for their evil deeds. The Signs of the Times, November 18, 1889, paragraph 6.
Looking upon the Father outside of Christ, Satan was transformed to consider himself immortal and self-existent. This falsehood caused him to see God's requirements as arbitrary, harsh, and unnecessarily restrictive. He came to see himself as the defender of life and liberty, and God as the menace to freedom and the cause of death. He projected his actions onto God while imagining God's actions in himself. His inward self-condemnation caused him to think that he could not be pardoned for his transgression. This thought led him to conceive a new form of justice that demanded the punishment of death. He endeavored to place this attribute upon God, and in doing this, he separated mercy from justice.
The sin of Lucifer is unexplainable. He was disloyal to God. His mourning and complaining aroused sympathy among the angelic hosts, and many took the same position as did Satan. How did the Lord break the force of these accusations? Because of Satan's accusing power, it was not the plan of God to deal with him as he deserved. The tempter would throw all the blame of his course upon others who were below him. He would make it appear that if he could have moved according to his own judgment, all this demonstration of rebellion would have been avoided. The condemning power of Satan would lead him to institute a theory of justice inconsistent with mercy. He claims to be officiating as the voice and power of God, claims that his decisions are justice, are pure, and without fault. Thus he takes his position on the judgment seat and declares that his counsels are infallible. Here his merciless justice comes in, a counterfeit of justice, abhorrent to God. But how shall the universe know that Lucifer is not a safe and just leader? To their eyes he appears right. They cannot see as God sees, beneath the outward covering. They cannot know as God knows. Then to work to unmask him and make plain to the angelic host that his judgment is not God's judgment, that he has made a standard of his own and exposed himself to the righteous indignation of God, would create a state of things which must be avoided. Letters and Manuscripts, Volume 7, Letter 16, A, July 4th, 1892.
The whole universe was influenced by Satan's counterfeit system of justice. As Ellen White states, to the eyes of the universe, Satan appeared to be correct.
It was most difficult to make the deceiving power of Satan apparent. His power to deceive increased with practice. If he could not defend himself, he must accuse, in order to appear just and righteous, and to make God appear arbitrary and exacting. In secret, he whispered his disaffection to the angels. There was at first no pronounced feeling against God, but the seed had been sown, and the love and confidence of the angels was marred. The sweet communion between them and their God was broken. Every move was watched. Every action was viewed in the light in which Satan had made them see things. That which Satan had instilled into the minds of the angels, a word here and a word there, opened the way for a long list of suppositions. In his artful way, he drew expressions of doubt from them. Then, when he was interviewed, he accused those whom he had educated. He laid all the disaffection on the ones he had led. As one in holy office, he manifested an overbearing desire for justice, but it was a counterfeit of justice which was entirely contrary to God's love and compassion and mercy. The Review and Herald, September 7, 1897, paragraphs 3 and 4.
Satan's defense was to make God appear arbitrary and exacting. He continued to place his own character attributes onto God. The whole universe came to view God in the false framework that Satan had created. Satan then challenged God that if he didn't punish wrongdoers, he was not a God of truth and justice.
In the opening of the great controversy, Satan had declared that the law of God could not be obeyed, that justice was inconsistent with mercy, and that, should the law be broken, it would be impossible for the sinner to be pardoned. Every sin must meet its punishment, urged Satan, and if God should remit the punishment of sin, he would not be a God of truth and justice. The Desire of Ages, page 761.4.
Satan will finally receive the judgment which he said God should exercise. Satan will receive the punishment which he conceived and taught. His self-condemnation will meet with his own idea of punishment. He demands it. In his mind, that is what is just for him.
Satan will be judged by his own idea of justice. It was his plea that every sin should meet its punishment. If God remitted the punishment, he said, he was not a God of truth or justice. Satan will meet the judgment which he said God should exercise. Manuscript Releases, Volume 12, page 413.1.
Let us ponder this carefully. God does not give to Satan what God desired, but gives Satan what he himself desired. Back to the beginning, we can see that in this atmosphere of false justice, Adam and Eve were instructed by both Christ and the heavenly angels.
Adam and Eve received instruction through direct communion with God. We behold the light of the knowledge of His glory in the face of Christ. Education, page 30.3. Holy angels often visited the garden and gave instruction to Adam and Eve concerning their employment, and also taught them concerning the rebellion and fall of Satan. The angels warned them of Satan and cautioned them not to separate from each other in their employment, for they might be brought in contact with this fallen foe. The angels also enjoined upon them to follow closely the directions God had given them, for in perfect obedience only were they safe. Then this fallen foe could have no power over them. Early Writings, page 147.1.
The line between the natural consequences of rebellion and the need for the arbitrary punishment of rebellion became blurred. The difference between the natural penalty of sin and an imposed penalty for sin was confused. The seeds of Satan's justice later manifested in the angels as they watched man's rebellion grow more determined. This doesn't mean that the good angels disobeyed God in any way, but there was an atmosphere of confusion and uncertainty around them in regard to the subject of justice.
After the fall of our first parents, Christ declared that in order to save man from the penalty of sin, he would come to the world to conquer Satan on the enemy's own battlefield. The controversy that began in heaven was to be continued on the earth. In this controversy, much was to be involved. Vast interests were at stake. Before the inhabitants of the heavenly universe were to be answered the questions, is God's law imperfect, in need of amendment or abrogation, or is it immutable? Is God's government in need of change, or is it stable? Before Christ's first advent, the sin of refusing to conform to God's law had become widespread. Apparently, Satan's power was growing. His warfare against heaven was becoming more and more determined. A crisis had been reached. With intense interest, God's movements were watched by the heavenly angels. Would he come forth from his place to punish the inhabitants of the world for their iniquity? Would he send fire or flood to destroy them? All heaven waited the bidding of their commander to pour out the vials of wrath upon a rebellious world. One word from him, one sign, and the world would have been destroyed. The worlds unfallen would have said, Amen, thou art righteous, O God, because thou hast exterminated rebellion. But God so loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. God might have sent his Son to condemn, but he sent him to save. Christ came as a Redeemer. No words can describe the effect of this movement on the heavenly angels. With wonder and admiration they could only exclaim, Herein is love. The Signs of the Times, August 27, 1902, paragraphs 2 through 5.
The angels and unfallen worlds were ready to exterminate the rebellion. This reflects the imposed justice of Satan. In God's system, there was no need to come forth from the throne to punish. The punishment was inherent within the actions of rebellion. The rebels were already suffering, and that suffering would only get worse the more they rebelled. What the universe needed was a revelation of God's character of love, not a demonstration of satanic justice. Here we find the answer to the mystery of why Adam did not go to God for counsel. The atmosphere within the universe influenced his thinking to believe that sin must be punished according to Satan's ideas of justice.
The influence of every man's thoughts and actions surrounds him like an invisible atmosphere, which is unconsciously breathed in by all who come in contact with him. This atmosphere is frequently charged with poisonous influences, and when these are inhaled, moral degeneracy is the sure result. Testimonies for the Church, Volume 5, page 111.1.
The heavenly angels were unconsciously affected by Satan's principles of justice. In telling Adam and Eve that there were consequences for disobedience, they spoke the truth. What was unspoken was how the consequences were delivered. Were they the inevitable fruit of their actions, or imposed arbitrary punishments from God? The answer to this was not clear to the angels. They were committed to God and His Son, but the atmosphere around them may have influenced Adam to conclude the consequences were imposed, not natural. Adam could not imagine God responding to Eve eating the forbidden fruit with anything other than death. Mercy had been separated from justice in his mind. Adam was accountable for his own actions. His decision to eat the fruit was not justified in the slightest. He knew enough to know that he should have sought the counsel and wisdom of God before making such a drastic decision. Satan had repeatedly told the universe that God does not forgive. In believing his own lies, he sinned. His sin was to attribute to God things that were not part of his character. This is a transgression of the law of life.
Satan was the first great rebel in heaven. On account of his power to deceive, he carried many of the holy angels on his side. God was truth and justice. God moved in a straightforward course to vindicate his law. Satan must yield or evade God's arguments. He came where the two roads branched. It was submission or open rebellion. He took the latter position. He had misconstrued, perverted, wrested the words of God until he carried with him a large number of the angels, a large number true, but for his deception. He practiced the work of accusing, of fraud, of deception, until he himself was his own dupe. He believed his own lies. His darkness was to him light, and light was darkness. To Satan, this was his ruin. He really had the advantage. Lucifer could lie, deceive, accuse. God cannot lie. God moved in a straightforward course. Lucifer moved in a crooked, wriggly, twisting course, serpent-like. Lucifer could be warned at the beginning of this course of sin as only God can warn, but his stubborn resistance and unbelief construed every merciful interposition of God into a pressure and restriction of his rights. He fancied himself for a time because he gained some of the angels to his side as superior to God. The Lord allowed Satan to go on until he should reveal himself in his true character. Christ alone, by giving himself a sacrifice, could destroy the works of Satan. Letters and Manuscripts, Volume 4, Manuscript 22, 1885, paragraph 17.
Adam followed Satan into this deception, and he came to believe that God would not forgive. He seconded Satan's thoughts in the belief that the blotting of sin could only be obtained through the punishment of transgression by death. In going against the clear statements of God and eating the fruit, Adam judged himself worthy of death. This sentence he passed upon Eve after she ate the fruit. Like Satan, Adam defended himself by blaming God for his transgression. His inward self-condemnation was projected onto God. This meant the only path to salvation for him lay in the death of the Son of God, because he was the one Adam blamed for creating Eve to be his tempter.
Then the man said, "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me of the tree, and I ate." Genesis 3:12.
After the fall of man, the whole universe wondered what God would do. Satan's justice appeared to rule the creation, and it seemed evident to all that man's rebellion should be punished. When the plan of redemption was revealed to the angels, and they understood Christ was willing to pay the penalty of sin, which the human race believed was needed for forgiveness, the angels offered to give their own lives to pay the penalty.
The angels prostrated themselves at the feet of their commander and offered to become a sacrifice for man. But an angel's life could not pay the debt. Only he who created man had power to redeem him. Patriarchs and Prophets, page 64.3.
This point establishes the fact that the angels were influenced by Satan's false justice. An angel could not pay the debt because God demanded no such payment. Secondly, an angel could not pay the debt because man would not accept the death of an angel as evidence of being forgiven. Christ now began his second function as high priest. He would condescend to act as man's mediator within the framework of satanic justice. This was part of Christ's cross of self-denial.
According to justice and retribution, God might have placed in the hands of his angelic ministers the vials of his wrath to be poured out upon a rebellious world to punish the inhabitants for their treatment of the Prince of Heaven, but he did not do this. Herein is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us, and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins. Isaiah tells us who and what our Redeemer is. Unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Christ had two natures, the nature of a man and the nature of God. In him divinity and humanity were combined. Upon his mediatorial work hangs the hope of the perishing world. No one but Christ has ever succeeded in living a perfect life, in living a pure, spotless character. He exhibited a perfect humanity, combined with deity, and by preserving each nature distinct, he has given to the world a representation of the character of God and the character of a perfect man. He shows us what God is and what man may become, godlike in character. Christ is our example. He placed himself at the head of the human family to accomplish a work the importance of which men do not comprehend, because they do not realize the privileges and possibilities before them as members of the human family of God. We may understand the subject of the work of Christ. His object was to reconcile the prerogatives of justice and mercy, and let each stand separate in its dignity, yet united. His mercy was not weakness, but a terrible power to punish sin because it is sin, yet a power to draw to it the love of humanity. Through Christ, justice is enabled to forgive without sacrificing one jot of its exalted holiness. Justice and mercy stood apart, in opposition to each other, separated by a wide gulf. The Lord our Redeemer clothed his divinity with humanity and wrought out in behalf of man a character that was without spot or blemish. He planted his cross midway between heaven and earth and made it the object of attraction which reached both ways, drawing both justice and mercy across the gulf. Justice moved from its exalted throne, and with all the armies of heaven approached the cross. There it saw one equal with God bearing the penalty for all injustice and sin. With perfect satisfaction, justice bowed in reverence at the cross, saying, "It is enough." Ellen White, General Conference Bulletin, October 1, 1899, article B, paragraph 20 to 22.
Justice and mercy were separated by a wide gulf because of Satan's accusations. Justice and mercy can't be separated in the mind of God, for God is not divided. Satan made justice and mercy inconsistent through his principle of punishment. Note carefully that Ellen White does not say God moved from his exalted throne, but that justice did. We remember from an earlier statement that Satan took his place on the throne, or judgment seat, and declared his statements to be infallible. As Satan sat upon the throne through his theory of justice, God must demonstrate the principle of punishment which all perceived to be divine.
In the sacrifice of God's only begotten Son is demonstrated the awful glory of divine justice and holiness. 12 Letters and Manuscripts, Manuscript 6, 1897, paragraph 6.
The cross of Christ reconciles what the universe perceives as divine justice with God's true merciful justice. God's justice is to show mercy. God showed mercy in giving His precious Son to die according to the principles that all believed were just. Thus both God's justice, mercy, and Satan's justice meet in the cross. They are drawn across the gulf both ways. Both are satisfied. God bows His head in satisfied acceptance, while Satan bows in reverence before the cross, because all his demands are met. But why was this necessary? Because Satan's justice had come to dominate the minds of all created beings.
The Savior's humanity elevates all humanity in the scale of moral value with God. It brings God and man very nigh together. As many as received Him, to them gave He power to become the sons of God. By giving His life to save fallen men, Christ gives all heaven to those that believe on Him. By dying in our behalf, He gave an equivalent for our debt. Thus He removed from God all charge of lessening the guilt of sin. By virtue of my oneness with the Father, He says, my suffering and death enable me to pay the penalty of sin. By my death a restraint is removed from His love. His grace can act with unbounded efficiency. The Youth's Instructor, December 16, 1897, paragraph 7.
Satan charged God with lessening the guilt of sin by not punishing it. The angels were influenced by this idea, and the human race fully embraced it. Christ had to die to uphold the sacredness of the law in the minds of men. The death of Christ removed from the minds of men the restraint of His Father's love. Christ took humanity upon Himself from the fall in order to become humanity's mediator and to present to God on humanity's behalf the offering which man thought was needed to be paid for reconciliation. Remember that the Bible tells us that the mediator is not a mediator of one position, but of two.
Now, a mediator does not mediate for one only, but God is one. Galatians 3:20.
Christ would represent both God's position of merciful love, as well as man's position of merciless justice that demands death as payment. Through His life of service, Christ would execute God's justice, Jeremiah 22:3, and through His death He would satisfy the condition man needed for reconciliation. God's ways are not our ways, and therefore Christ must represent both God's ways as well as condescend to represent ours. But as Paul says, God is one. There is only one truth which shall prevail. After Christ offered Himself to God as a sacrifice on man's behalf, He could reconcile man's justice with God's mercy. Our beloved High Priest could then lead us from the bloody brass altar of sacrifice to the golden altar of incense presenting God's presence of love and grace. Oh, the condescension and love of God to come down into our darkened perceptions of justice and lead us by the hand into the full light of His mercy. Eternity shall never be able to fully reveal the magnitude of this love.